I'm excited, really excited to talk to you two about the work you're doing on this front. To set a little context for folks in the audience, the gender gap in internet usage is somewhat astounding. So when we think about women using the internet around the world, globally, women are 12% less likely to be on the internet than men. When we start looking at developing countries, that gap widens to 32.9%. Looking at India, which is where I'm from, the gap is actually even wider, with 71% of internet users being male and only 29% being female. So given these gaps, a lot of research has been done on the impact of that gap in usage on women's access to jobs, women's access to resources. A study that's being conducted at the Fletcher School in Boston right now in partnership with MasterCard has found that there's a connection between the access women have to the internet, to mobile phones, to landlines, and their ability to participate in the economy, literacy rates, their ability to open accounts at financial institutions, and their participation in government. This study found that between the years 2008 and 2011, the percentage of digital women taking up access to the internet, with every increase with every percentage point increase in women accessing the internet, they found that women's access to labor, financial instruments, government, and literacy rose by 2.3%. So there's a direct connection between digital literacy and women's access in terms of economic development. Elena, I want to start with you to talk about what some structural gaps might be that exist between women and digital literacy. Why is there a gap?
You'll see a lot of reasons happening around the world. A lot lends to education, a lot will lend to roles in the household. We're particularly focused on women who are at the professional level, and so we see people kind of dropping out of having roles outside of the home at different levels in their careers, depending on where you're looking around the world.
Trish, in some of the work you've done, you've worked with activists around the world. Have you seen particular barriers exist in countries that you've worked in so far?
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that Alana mentioned are problems everywhere in the world. I'd say another thing that I see everywhere is the confidence gap. So there is the education gap and the access gap, but women tend to lack confidence more than their male colleagues. In a lot of places, culturally, the woman is not encouraged to speak up or to put herself in leadership positions. And so often, even if they get into those jobs, they aren't raising their hand for the promotion. There's a lot of studies that show that men tend to apply for jobs that are, at the next level before they actually think they're ready, much more often than women. And, I just recently was a reader for a fellowship program, and I read 40 applications from women all over the world. And one of the questions was, what is your biggest challenge? And the vast majority of them said that they have lack of confidence, that they want a coach, and they wanted to be part of this fellowship because they want to know how to put themselves out there and to strive. And so I see that as a big challenge.
I just want to challenge one of the statements around confidence, because people talk about that a lot, and I don't find that it's quite the accurate way to describe what's happening. To me, when you say lacking confidence, like I imagine kind of a wet noodle person who doesn't kind of want to go out there and do it. And the thing is it's just society kind of makes it a little bit harder for you to express this motivation. And, it's a little bit harder to express it, but then it's harder for other people to hear it. The reactions are different. If a woman does, the opposite of, lack of confidence, I guess, would be bravery. If you do show that bravery, it's often has a different reaction that can be negative. And so it is something. What you're saying is completely accurate, but I don't like the word confidence.
I
or
think
lack of confidence.
No, I agree with you. It's more of the way people perceive and accept the women expressing themselves that way, and I think that culturally it's harder for women to do that, and that like the women that I'm talking about. They want it. They do. They have the desire. It's just that they need maybe a different setup or change in the work environment to be accepting of women with confidence. Yeah.
I think it also differs country to country. So
Sure.
In India, I know, being from India, I know one of the 4 kind of job profiles that parents want you to go into is engineering, as a woman as well. So they're like, be an engineer. If you can't be an engineer, fine, be a doctor. If you can't be a doctor, fine, be a lawyer. So, it's engineering is up there. And to your point, Elena, I think it's societal expectations of the country or the region that you're in can have a huge influence on whether women believe that there is place for them in tech. We've talked a little bit about women going into tech jobs. Another aspect of this conversation is even if women are not going into tech jobs, there's a gap in whether they're using the internet at all in the first place or using mobile phones. Have either of you encountered in the work you've done across the world in the many countries you've worked in issues or structural barriers that are keeping women from accessing the internet, accessing mobile phones, things about the societies that they're living in that prevent them from being able to access?
We're typically working with women who are in the tech industry, and so they're not experiencing that. But certainly when you look around the world, there's more agrarian societies where people are actually still illiterate and don't have running water, but they're starting to get access to mobile technology. And so, that's probably where that bigger gap is. And
we also primarily work with women in cities or at least larger towns, so we don't reach out into the rural areas very much, where I think it's more of a problem. But we also work a lot with women in the nonprofit sector, and so we definitely see some fear of technology or also lack of access to training on how to use it. So if you're a nonprofit leader in here or in any country and you don't have funding to go to training, it can be very overwhelming to know which tool to choose. There's so many tools out there, and even if they have access to the tool itself, they don't always have access to the training and the support for it. And so sometimes they'll just, choose not to use it. And then the gap between the for-profit and the nonprofit sector skills, the gap widens.
Trish, I'd love to have you dig into that a little bit deeper, because I know that's a lot of the work that Wake does is training women in nonprofits on technologies. Can you talk more about the model you use at Wake?
Sure. So most of my career has been in international development, and I spent a lot of time traveling and working with women's organizations in developing countries. And then in the last 5 to 10 years, I started doing mentoring programs for them, specifically with technology. And so I got to meet a lot of women in tech who became mentors to the women in the countries. And I saw that while the mentees were gaining a lot of skill, that also the women in tech, the mentors, were gaining a great amount of interesting experience and leadership opportunity. And if you've ever been a mentor or a teacher, you realize that you're gaining as much as you're giving. And so the work that we do is really bringing those two pieces together. So we bring women in tech to countries of focus, and they use their skills and their tools from their everyday lives in workshops for nonprofit leaders. And we primarily focus on nonprofit leaders who are working on women's and girls' rights, whether it's fighting human trafficking or gender-based violence or child marriage. And so it's really capacity building and training for the nonprofits on how to use tech and communications to do their work better. And then it's also cultural and global citizen opportunities for the women in tech.
What are some of the countries that you've worked in so far?
We started out in Ukraine, and then we went to Cambodia, and then we went to Guatemala. And in Guatemala, we trained women from all across Central America, so it was a regional workshop. And then most recently, we did it here in the United States. So we felt like, especially for what's going on politically in our country, women's rights is very at the front of the mind for a lot of people. And so we brought social and gender justice leaders from 15 different states here to the Bay Area in January and did a week-long tech training for them.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Alina, I have a question for you. So given that women going into tech, especially like here in the United States, it can be a lonely path. Often you're the only person in your computer science class or one of very few. If you're a woman of color, then your likelihood of meeting someone else who's like you is even lower. I'd love to hear from you the power of building networks with other women across different schools, across different countries, and some of the work you're doing through Women Who Code and doing that.
Yeah, so Women Who Code is the world's largest and most active community of technical women in the world. We've got 137,000 members, and we are putting on an average of 5 free technical events daily, every day throughout the year. What we've really learned through doing this is how important belonging is. There's a data point out there, or some research out there that's shown that women are leaving the tech industry at a rate of 55% mid-career. And if you don't make it to the second half of your career, you can't make it to the executive positions, you can't make it to the technical leadership, and really hold the power to make huge change in the industry. So one of the huge things that we're able to provide is a sense of belonging, and that's so important, like you said, when you're the only or the one of two. And sometimes what we'll hear is, I was on this team, it was great, I loved my job, and then we got another woman on the team, and it was so much better. And sometimes you'll, just throughout every single day, little tiny things that make you feel as though you don't belong, or that kind of separate you or make it a little bit harder for you throughout the day. So small that if you actually complained about a single one of them, you'd be that weird person who complained. And they build up. And 10 years later, something happens like you're not getting along with your boss, or you're not on a good project and it's not going well, or you get passed over for a leadership position because someone felt the other person had leadership potential, even though you had more experience, you had been writing better code, you attracted more people to your team. People still identified you as the person who should be working in marketing or recruiting, or, was the person to ask for directions. So having that sense of belonging, being able to discuss these little tiny things, these little experiences that you might go through in a safer space, reminds you, yes, there are tons of talented women in the tech industry. I do belong. And I think that while it's sounds very obvious, it actually plays a very big role in how people set their goals and how excited they are about their careers and wanting to stay in them. We just had an event in Manila, and at the end, one of the women came up to the leaders and she actually started crying, and she said, you know what, I was actually going to leave the industry and I just feel as though I belong now.
Trish, before you founded Wake, you ran for many years the Tech Women program. I'd love to hear from you some of the stories that came out of Tech Women as well, in terms of women from around the world being the only, being able to get together with other women in a space with mentors here in Silicon Valley.
Sure. So the Tech Women program is a U.S. State Department program. It was started under Hillary Clinton, and it brings women in the tech industry from Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East. And they come here to Silicon Valley for a month-long mentorship program, and they get matched with women in the tech industry. So they'll get placed at companies all around the Bay Area, and they go to work for 4 days of the week, and then on the 5th day they have workshops and trainings on things like entrepreneurship. And they also learn so they are being mentored by the women in tech, but they're also learning how to be mentors. So they're encouraged when they go home to their countries to pay it forward and mentor young girls who are interested in tech in their countries. And the program's been going now, I think, for 7 years, and the network is so strong. My Facebook feed is filled with people from here going over there. One of our mutual friends, Eileen, has been a mentor for many years. She works at Symantec, and she right now is in Tunisia because one of the Tunisian mentees had really progressed in her career, and now she is a leader in tech in her own country, and she was putting on and organizing a conference on women in tech there. And so she got some of the women, this is well past the program itself, and a bunch of women from here went over and were speakers and organized it with her. So I see everyday examples of women from that program starting up their own companies and getting support, financial support, advice, and it's very much a two-way program, and so that the women here are learning so much from the women in all the countries and vice versa, and it's really, I think, created this amazing network of belonging across borders, and it sounds, so much like what you're doing too, and just the women love each other, and they would do anything for each other, and not just personally, not just talking about, they talk about family and kids and all those things, but professionally, they love each other professionally and do anything to help each other get the job in that new tech company or to start something new. And I think that is what's so powerful, is that they're helping each other become those leaders of the tech industry, and then they all want to pay it forward and help the next generation too.
Yeah, some of them have gone on to become women who code leaders in their own cities.
Yeah, yeah, it's so cool.
So there's a benefit to the women themselves being included in the tech industry, of being able to lead and show their skills and rise. Could you speak to some of the benefits that society at large gains from having women who've been previously shut out from tech or kept out of tech be able to join, be able to show their skills and talents and rise? Have either of you seen examples of what these women have brought to the industry in terms of innovation?
Everybody wins when more women participate in the tech industry. Women win because the tech industry is a great place with great jobs that pay well, that are flexible. And the industry wins because the industry is currently, in the U.S. alone, 600,000 jobs shy of the market needs. And companies win because when teams are diverse, they're smarter. When companies have women in leadership positions, they have a stronger ROI, they have a higher ROI. And the world wins because when women make more money, they reinvest 90% in their community and their families. And so it creates a virtuous cycle of giving and further development.
She said it so well. Yeah, all of those things are so important.
One other question I had for you is thinking about once women get into tech careers, some of the challenges they face, and trends you see for addressing those challenges to make sure that women are able to stay and don't leave. So, Elena, you spoke to some of these challenges that women face mid-career. Trish, have you seen in the women you've worked with some of the barriers that they're seeing inside companies?
Well, I think that Elena touched on this briefly, but the dropout rate is alarming, and so that women, in India, where you're from, joining the tech industry, it's really high. It's way better than here, but then there is an issue with leveling out, either dropping out or not progressing to leadership positions. I think a lot of that has to do with family pressures. And when I was working on a mentoring program in India a couple of years ago, I spoke with a lot of companies that were starting retention programs when women went out on maternity leave, that they had programs to stay engaged with the women so that while they were out, they were still talking to them and making sure they felt connected to the company and to the culture. And also there was a lot of outreach and engagement with the families. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was a really interesting and creative way to try to make sure that obviously having kids is a big turning point for a lot of people and is a dangerous place where the pipeline gets leaky, and so doing something to really engage women and their families around that time seemed really strategic to me.
When I was at Symantec as a diversity business partner there, we had a very big population of female engineers in India, and one of their issues was once they had children, family pressure for them to stay at home and take care of the children. And one intervention we found that worked was to have a nursery on site, to have creches on site so women could be with their children on site. Another issue we found was women fearing for their safety going home later in the evening. And so we actually brought in shuttles so that every employee could take the shuttle home. And so that was an example of something that benefited women in terms of safety, but also benefited the rest of the employees in terms of transportation.
Yeah, we see that as well, different challenges. And in some places like India and Eastern Europe, we see much higher percentages of women participating in the tech industry, but then the drop-off just occurs at some other point. So
I'm going to turn now to these questions, so thank you for writing these down for us. The first one I have here is, how can men be better allies in the workplace to support women? Thoughts?
That's a great question. It comes up a lot, and I kind of categorize the majority of men into three categories. One who aren't really paying attention, ones who really want to help but don't know how, and ones that are already killing it. They're out there. So I'll throw out one tip, and then I would love to hear tips from you as well, and maybe we can move people along just into one category over. Advocate for at least one woman in your company. Help her to know that it's time to ask for a promotion, that it's time to ask for a raise. Help her navigate politics and side of the organization and figure out where her next step is, and understand and champion her when she does well, because like I said earlier, it's a little bit less socially acceptable for her to champion herself. And so to have someone else go to her boss or her boss's boss or a colleague in a different department and just say, wow, she did so well on that project. She's so great to work with. She's just knows how to talk about the product. We should think about, promoting her or, having her lead the team or something like that. She both knows her job and knows how to do this and this and this. And that's so often one of the things that happens is you just need someone to point out that all of these extra things that you're taking on as a woman inside of the company actually are value adds instead of just expected.
Yeah, I think sponsorship, whether it's formal or informal, is such a great component of that. And a lot of companies do have mentoring programs, and so many women think that they should only have a women mentor, and that's really valuable and creates great bonds. But I think having a mentor or a sponsor as a male too, some companies actually have incentives for male sponsors to, choose a woman who they give shout outs to and are more formally helping them progress in their careers. But also, I think another one is just more casually inviting a woman colleague out to do something, because, and I know that's like also tricky and in our current times, but doing something outside of work together, whether it's a volunteer opportunity or a sporting event or something, it just creates a nice bond as a human being. And I think we all help promote each other and look out for each other in different ways when we have those human connections. And so, it doesn't have to be playing golf, but it can be rock climbing or, just something that's fun and creates that human connection. I think really is a nice way to have women and men know each other in different ways outside of work, and it feeds into a more productive work relationship as well.
Yeah, and one quick tip I would say is when you're in a room, when you're in a meeting, when you're in the boardroom, depending on what your role is, look around the table and see who's there and who's not there. So whose voice isn't here right now, and figure out how can we invite that person's voice in. So if you're discussing a project or you're discussing even something informally at the bar or at the water cooler, and you notice that everyone there happens to be male or everyone happens to be from a certain group and there's someone who's missing, invite that person in or save the conversation for a time when that person can be involved and their voice can be heard. Often decisions get made, especially if you're the one woman on the team or you're the one of two women on the team, a lot of decisions get made when you're not even there to be able to represent your point of view. So it's a quick, simple tip is just pay attention to who's around you in a moment. If the woman isn't there, invite her voice in. You can save this conversation for another time where she can participate. You can call her in if she's around. It's something that any person can do, whatever level they are at in a company or in an organization. Next question, Trish, this one's for you. Can you talk more about Tech to Empower and how Wake has been able to push the boundaries on social justice issues?
Sure. So our belief is that nonprofit leaders are already doing the great work that they need to do for their communities. So we just look to see who's leading the effort in social justice or gender justice, and we see ourselves as just bringing more tools and resources to them. And so by bringing them tech training and tech advisors, we think that they'll be able to save money by doing more of the tech and communications themselves. They'll be able to get their message out to connect with their community. They'll be able to tell their stories more effectively for fundraising, and they'll be able to run their organizations more efficiently. So an example of that is in Cambodia, a friend from Google came with us And she said, at first, she said, I don't think I have any skills that I can offer to nonprofit leaders in Cambodia. I'm just a project manager at Google. And so we talked, and she ended up doing a training on Google collaboration tools, things that we maybe all take for granted in our daily lives. But she did this training for organizations that were working on trafficking. And afterwards, this guy, we include men in our training as well, and this guy wrote us and said, thanks to Google collaboration tools, I don't have to travel, and my staff doesn't have to travel all around the country. And previously, they'd been doing about 20 visits a year out to all of their offices in the provinces. And so as a result, they were doing a lot of their meetings through Google Hangouts. They were exchanging information and collaborating on Google Docs. And so he said they saved about $300 a month. And with that $300 a month, they were able to sponsor 6 more women in their shelter, which provided support and services for survivors of trafficking. So, a very basic tool that we all take for granted can really change the way that nonprofits are able to run their work and reach more people.
I have so many more questions to choose from now. Elena, I had one here for you. You mentioned that the compounding weight of constant and frequent microaggressions and micro-invalidations can really weigh down on people. Besides belonging, what are some other ways you've seen women overcome these challenges? So besides finding community with each other.
Another thing that we focus on is not planning for your next promotion, but really the one after that and the one after that, because you don't actually become prepared for your future role a month before you get that promotion. You're actually preparing for that today. And so we really focus on building the skills outside of your role that actually help to contribute to you getting higher level positions. So think about, taking speaking opportunities. It might start as, a 5-minute lightning talk, writing blogs and not just publishing it on your own blog. You should do that also, but publishing it on like Women Who Code's blog or someone else's to help amplify your voice, getting out there and participating in the broader tech community. So in addition to our events, we give away about $500,000 in conference tickets every year because we want you to get out there and engage in the broader tech community. You'll meet the people that you need to meet and learn from experts in your field and hopefully be inspired to go out and give a talk or take on a bigger role. We had a woman step up as a leader with Women Who Code about a year ago. I met her for the first time in April, and she was a new Women Who Code leader at the time. And she just posted in our group Slack channel this week. She said, I can't believe that about 6-7 months ago, I was writing that I'd gotten promoted to lead engineer at my company. I just accepted a job, and she talked about the company, that it was a good company she was excited to work for, as a director level position. And so by taking on these skill-based volunteering and going kind of outside of what she needed for her role today, she in 1 year, which is incredible, has jumped 2 rungs in the ladder. So.
That's awesome. I have another question here that's really interesting. You mentioned that often women are the only ones on a team and feel so much better when another one joins. Many times, though, it's the opposite, and it makes it worse because we feel competition for a single spot. Can you speak to what needs to change in our perception of ourselves and each other for us to stop being each other's worst enemy?
Yeah, so the feeling of being the only lasts until actually women represent more than 25% of the team. So there's a different dynamic when there's a feeling of you're the the token, versus this is just the way things are. 50% of the jobs, because women aren't a minority, half the population, actually should be going to women. It's not that if one woman gets a job, another one doesn't. So my answer to that is more women.
I would agree. I think there's a research study done, maybe at Stanford, that said you need a 30% critical mass in order for people not to feel like they're jockeying for attention with each other, and it's not on those two people. It's on the rest of the system, the rest of the organization, to make sure that we're meeting that 30% critical mass. Question on generational changes. Are you seeing in the work you're doing differences in generations in their attitudes towards tech, especially with young girls?
One of my favorite things to say is why I, on a generational level, feel that we're moving in the right direction is when my mother graduated from college, she was really given the option of becoming a teacher, nurse, or a secretary. So one generation later, I'm sitting up here saying, we don't have enough women CTOs and CEOs and investors and board members. And so when my children or the next generation grows up, I hope that it sounds as bizarre that there's under 5% women CEOs on Fortune 100 companies, as it does to me that, graduating from university, I might become but that my options would be kind of limited to being a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary.
I also think that the younger generation is changing the tech industry, and we've seen that there's a big trend in volunteer time off. So tech companies, a lot of them are giving paid time off to their employees to go do volunteer work. And increasingly, people are choosing where they work based on whether or not the company holds similar values to them and is supportive of them pursuing their passions, which are, so they're not just looking at it as a 9-to-5 job anymore, but they're looking at the cultures of the companies. And women, especially, and millennials are making those choices increasingly based on whether or not they can do volunteer work and be paid for it, or, bring in panels of different role models, or, do things with girls to encourage them in tech. And so I think that's really encouraging to see that their employers are sitting up and taking notice, because they want to hit their diversity figures. They want more women. They want that, all the benefits that you talked about of having a diverse workforce, and that means also giving people the chance to be more holistic human beings, and that is also good for the tech industry, and that's really being driven by the younger generation.
Question about both of your organizations. So what challenges have you both had in creating and sustaining these organizations, socially, monetarily, etc.?
How old is your organization?
6 years this year.
Okay. Mine's 3. We just turned 3, so youngest first, maybe. The biggest challenge is funding, always. We're a small team of 3, and I think we could do so much more if I don't want to ever become a huge organization with lots of overhead, but with a little bit more human power, we could reach a lot more countries and support a lot more nonprofit organizations and make a bigger change in social and gender justice by providing them more tech training and support. So I think funding, like so many nonprofits, that's a challenge. And then also getting into the right tech companies and knowing what is the best tools and tips to offer nonprofit leaders. So just wanting to always be keeping up to date with what is happening with tech and making sure that we're making culturally appropriate choices too when we're making recommendations and offering trainings.
So one that I think is kind of bizarre is people always think that we can do everything instead of kind of staying focused on what we do and what we do best. And so people will automatically expect us to work with other organizations that are doing slightly similar work from us. And nobody ever says, hey, Coke, are you partnering with Pepsi? And it doesn't mean that it's not the same, like we're a nonprofit. But whenever we do work together and we do it often, it doesn't yield the reward of us staying focused on what our goals are and what our mission is. It usually ends up expending more energy. So that's a really weird thing that I find constantly. Instead of people saying, "Oh, let me introduce you to this person that's going to be able to make you take a leap," they're like, why don't you guys partner together and slow both of your missions down? The other thing is, if you're thinking of doing a nonprofit, I strongly recommend considering mission-driven for-profit, unless whatever you're doing absolutely pulls on the heartstrings of people, or you can get massive amounts of like government grant funding for it. Almost nobody donates to Women Who Code kind of out of the goodness of their hearts. Almost all of our funding comes from like producing an ROI for whoever's funding us, just the way a for-profit would. But we have a lot more compliance that we have to participate in, which means more of the side of the business that isn't our mission, which isn't the fun part. So whatever you can do to spend more time on your mission and doing the work that you love is what you should focus on.
Quick question for folks who might not know, what's ROI?
Oh, return on investment.
Okay, thank you.
Return on investment.
Business speak.
Yeah, business speak. Sorry.
We have a couple of questions here actually about populations who may not be in your sweet spots. So talking about folks who are in rural or developing areas who don't have access to technology, what's something you know about, or what work do you know is happening to improve the lives of those people and improve their access to technology?
We don't work directly with rural populations, but a lot of the organizations that we do work with serve those communities. And so I know a lot of them are using, some are using basic tech, like radio is still a thing that's really important in the world. So I think that it's especially critical when working with rural populations to think about which tech and why. So not just starting a tech program when maybe that's not, maybe those people have mobile phones, but they're not smartphones. And there's a lot of organizations that don't think through what level of tech is correct. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges I see with nonprofits is in designing tech for rural areas. But there are definitely a lot of great ones out there. And also tech is more and more accessible. I just heard about a program that works with a refugee camp in southern Lebanon that has about 10,000 people living there. And there was an aid organization that was giving out debit cards to help support these families, and they were giving out the debit cards only to the males in the family. And, that's not a great idea. And the women got together through WhatsApp I mean, they're living in a refugee camp, but they have access to phones. And so through WhatsApp, they organized a movement to change that, and also they ended up starting, and then as a result, because they had sort of organized themselves and just connected through WhatsApp, they started small businesses together. So then they also got a small stream of income by making these crafts and selling them in the town nearby. And so, there are very simple tools that can assist in organizing and benefiting rural communities, but we don't work directly in that area.
Yeah, I would say from the work I used to do in my previous life before coming to diversity and inclusion, I worked for a access to legal justice nonprofit, and we worked mostly through using technology because we found we could get to people on their phones, we could get to people on browsers on their phones more than we could get to them through the internet on a laptop. So often it's figuring out what device people have access to and what interface they're working with. Prior to this panel, I was reading about a couple of instances. For example, M-Pesa, which is a financial payment system that people use their mobile phones to send and receive money, has been a huge economic boon to women in Kenya who have been able to start businesses and collect money and save money through that platform, which before they weren't able to do because they didn't have access to the banking system. There's also a case in which Instagram has been used by women in Saudi Arabia to market their handicraft and gain followers and gain business in a way that they couldn't because of the bureaucracy in that country and because of social norms. So using the technology that's available to people where they're at and figuring out what are some innovative ways to leverage that technology.
I was really blown away last year at our conference in Bangalore. There were some very young women. They were actually high school age who had participated in kind of a hackathon where they built a project. And their project was focused on water conservation for farmers. And so they were going to be sending text messages when water started to flow at the wrong rate because they had sensors out in the fields. And they also took into consideration that a lot of those farmers were actually illiterate. And so the text was actually, it wasn't received as a text, it would be received as a phone call that would speak out what the problem was, so that it kind of addressed this need that I think people in San Francisco wouldn't have even been able to think about. When I see projects here, it's often how to get pizza delivered to you faster. So it's great when you look around the world and you see people with different experiences and perspectives that they can come up with really powerful projects.
Awesome. Somewhat related to this is a question, what skills do you see changing in the next 5 years? So related to how you think tech might change in the next 5 years or the needs of users.
Ooh, it's changing.
Predict the future.
Yeah, predict the future. All right. Who's got their investments, their checkbook out right now? We're going to start investing in companies. I mean, AI is huge. I think that, driverless vehicles is going to be a big game changer. And mobile continue to outpace just web. I think, the traditional being at your laptop is going to go further and further away, just kind of the way being at your desktop has gone away.
And also just the integration of everything, the Internet of Things, and how, at least in the developed world, how everything is connected and what that will mean, I don't know. But it's going to be, in 5 years, so much will have changed.
Yeah.
Have you seen innovations in your work around the world that we may not have seen here yet in terms of the way tech is going?
Have you?
Mobile payments came to Kenya a lot, years before they came here. And I remember when I was working in Nairobi in 2012, 2013, I was working with a grassroots nonprofit, and two of the guys were sitting at the desk, and one took the other's samosa and started eating it and said, "Don't worry, I'll M-Pesa you five later." And it blew my mind. I had no idea what they were talking about. They had to explain mobile payments to me. So that was an instance of something starting in Kenya, and I think in Afghanistan, mobile payment really took off there and came here only years later.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's much more advanced. People are paying their water bills by WeChat, and I was in China for work, but I had a driver, and I didn't speak Mandarin, and he didn't speak English, so I would talk into my app in English, and it would come out for him in Mandarin, and vice versa. And so I just had no barrier of communication.
That's so cool. Also, I think SMS is used much more widely and more effectively in other countries to deliver even just one-way communication, whether it's weather alerts or health information, maternal health tips, things like that, I think are used because fewer people have smartphones. SMS is used more effectively, I think, in other parts of the world.
That's true. Political campaigns as well.
Yeah. Texting,
Text
like
messages.
basic text messaging. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great. As an outsider to the tech industry, there's a huge sentiment that tech folks work long hours and work in insulated communities of tech. Are women changing these cultures, and how? So Trish, you talked a little bit to that in terms of volunteerism. Is there anything else about the work-life, I hate saying work-life balance, but work-life balance that's changing with the changing demographics in tech?
Well, I think, a lot of tech startups don't have childcare or maternity leave until a woman in the company actually gets pregnant, and they're like, oh, usually it's a bunch of 25-year-olds, and then a woman gets pregnant, and then those policies change. And so I think there's a lot of examples of women and men as they age and go through sort of like family changes. That certainly is part of it. And also I would imagine that would also be true in terms of like flexible schedules, and that I think that's mostly driven by women out of necessity maybe, or out of desire. And so I think women are making tech maybe a more friendly, family-friendly space.
One thing I've seen in my work at Google is that the norms change with women first bringing, like Trish, like you say, a woman gets pregnant and they realize that you have to deal with life outside of work. But one thing I've seen that's really shifted at Google is that men have started taking parental leave too. And so the cultural norm is that if you are a parent, you deserve to be with your child. And what that does is also relieve the burden on the woman who, if her husband isn't allowed to take parental leave, then she's the one that has to carry most of the burden of childcare. So being able to, having equal access to parental leave across genders actually is beneficial for men and their partners at home.
Absolutely. Yeah, I strongly believe in that. Actually, Women Who Code has the same amount of parental leave, whether you've adopted, you're a male or a woman, because you're setting kind of the habits that'll last a lifetime. So if you can start off, sharing those roles, then that will carry over and allow both sides to have a more balanced work life.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up. Thank you again so much, Trish and Elena. Thank you all for coming. and I'll stick around to chat later. Thank you.